Welcome to KINE2253, Motor Development Across the Lifespan. This lecture will discuss the 6th chapter of Lifespan Motor Development, the 7th edition by Haywood and Getchell. This lecture will provide supplementary examples and explanations to help provide a deeper understanding of the book chapter.
In this lecture, students will examine the developmental sequence of specific ballistic skills, including throwing, kicking, punting, and striking. We will also discuss the individual constraints that affect the development of ballistic skills. Let's begin by first defining what ballistic skills are. Ballistic skills are any movement in which a person applies force to an object to project it. This includes the different forms of throwing, kicking, and striking. Similar developmental patterns are observed for these different ballistic skills. This is likely due to the mechanical principles that govern object projection that we discussed in Chapter 3. The vast majority of research studies have focused on the development of overhand or forceful throwing, but many basic principles and patterns apply to other skills. Let's take a closer look at throwing and the developmental sequence for this type of ballistic skill. There are several different types of throwing patterns. Underarm throwing includes two-hand throwing, in which the wind-up is between the legs. Sometimes this is called a granny-style throw or shot. This also includes one-hand underarm throws. This could include rolling, like in bowling, or a softball-style pitch. Sidearm throws are slightly less prevalent, but require a very different movement pattern. The most common type of throw is an overarm throw. Overarm throws include two-hand throws, like those in soccer or basketball, or one-arm throws, like those in baseball and football. There are different ways to assess throwing skills. Product measurements are of the outcome of the throw. This includes the accuracy of the throw, the distance of the throw, and the velocity of the ball. Process measurements examine the movement patterns or sequences. Because individual constraints like muscle mass, muscle strength, and body size can affect product measurements, the process measurements may be more useful to teachers and coaches interested in examining the development of throwing. Before we examine the different components of throwing, let's first recall that movements like throwing, kicking, and striking are open kinetic chain movements. This means that the hand, foot, or striking implement are freely moving and there is nothing directly restricting the movement. This also means that the movement or force generation of each segment contributes to the movement of the hand, foot, or striking implement. When the sequence of movements are well coordinated and the timing is correct, we have an efficient and powerful system. We will examine validated movement sequences, which are based on longitudinal studies of movement performance that show consistent patterns or follow a consistent order across individuals. This is similar to our pattern of motor milestones that we discussed in infancy. Although the timing of the acquisition of when each stage occurs varies by individual, the order of the sequences or stages is relatively consistent across individuals. Let's examine the major components of the throwing motion. The arm action can be broken into two major components, a preparatory phase or backswing, and the forward swing. The upper and lower arm contribute and move differently during each of these phases of movement. Next, we can examine the trunk action. The trunk can move forwards, backwards, and rotate. The rotation can occur with the whole trunk moving as one single unit, or with the hips and shoulders moving independently. Last, we can examine the foot or leg action. This is predominantly with respect to the step, particularly which foot steps and when the steps occur. Before we examine all of the details of the developmental sequence of throwing, we must first compare early and proficient throwing. Let's look at real examples of overarm throwing. Let's first start with an early thrower. Pay close attention to the actions at the arms, trunk, and legs. Now let's examine a proficient thrower. Pay close attention to the actions of the arms, trunk, and legs. Let's look more carefully at the differences between early and proficient throwers. The observations here are found in Table 8.1 in the book. I will not cover all of the details for every step in the sequence of throwing for each component. However, you should become familiar with the steps for the quiz as well as for your next group lab assignment. It might be helpful to have your book open or to print out the slides so that you can examine Table 8.1 as we look at the images for each example. Let's start with slide 14 so you can look at the images as I speak. Let's first look at the different examples with respect to the trunk action. Big changes that occur from step 1 to step 3 is that the trunk goes from no motion, or just forwards and backwards motion in step 1, to what is called block rotation, meaning that the hips and shoulders rotate together in step 2. The final stage, step 3, is differentiated rotation, in which the hips rotate before the shoulders start to rotate. Now let's look at the differences in the backswing with respect to the humerus and forearm action. From stage 1 to stage 4, the major differences are as follows. In stage 1, there is no backswing. It looks more like a shot put or a push than a throw. In the next stage, we see upward flexion of the elbow and the shoulder. This type of movement can be called a chicken wing. The next stage incorporates a backswing. In step 3, we see that the elbow is moving in a circle overhead or obliquely to the side, whereas in step 4, the elbow moves in a down and back motion. In this last stage, the arm drops below the waist during the backswing. Now let's look at the humerus and forearm action in the forward swing components. Both of these components have 3 steps. With respect to the humerus action, in step 1, the humerus is oblique, or to the side, due to external rotation at the shoulder. In step 2, the humerus is aligned with the body at release, such that the elbow is pointing at the target, which requires horizontal adduction. In step 3, the humerus is aligned with the body, but upon release, the elbow is pointing sideways. Now let's look at the forearm action of the forward swing. In step 1, the forearm and the ball move together in the same line of action. In step 2, the forearm and the ball lag or remain stationary while the rest of the body is moving until just before the body is front facing. In step 3, the forearm lags until after the body is front facing. What I mean by this is that the shoulders are turned to face the target, and then the forearm moves to catch up and moves forward towards the target. Lastly, let's look at the foot action. In step 1, the child does not step. In step 2, the step is homolateral. That means that if I throw with my right arm, I step with my right leg. In step 3, there is a small contralateral step, meaning that if I throw with my right arm, I step with my left leg. Lastly, in step 4, there is a long contralateral step. As we mentioned in chapter 3, the long step increases the linear distance over which we are applying a force. This results in a more powerful throw. Now let's examine the observational plan for throwing in more detail. For the sake of brevity, we will focus only on the most proficient movement pattern for each component. However, you should look at each major question that differentiates the different steps in the developmental sequence. First, we will look at the foot action. Again, as we saw on the last slide, step 4 is characterized by a long contralateral step, which is evident in the bottom right corner. With respect to the trunk action, step 3 is characterized by differentiated rotation at the hip and shoulders. Again, this means that the hips begin to move forward and then the shoulders move forward afterwards. With respect to the backswing action, step 4 is characterized by a circular downward backswing. Again, in this step, the hand and ball fall below the waist during the backswing. This is evident in the image to the right. When we break down the forward swing action and examine the position of the humerus, step 4 is characterized by a humerus lag. When the shoulders rotate to be front-facing, the humerus is not yet in line with the trunk. There is no horizontal adduction of the upper arm before front-facing. The humerus will not move forward until the shoulders are close to the end of their front-facing movement. When we examine the forearm movement during the forearm swing, step 3 is characterized by a forearm lag. Like the humerus action, the lag means that the forearm is positioned relatively behind the humerus. It will not begin moving until the humerus is close to the end of its movement forwards. So the elbow will not start to extend until the humerus is completely front-facing. Allowing this segmental lag from the legs to the trunk to the upper arm to the forearms allows momentum to be transferred, thereby increasing the speed of the throw if the sequence is well timed. Now that we have learned a bit about the different components and have examined our observational plan, one important thing to keep in mind is the best angle to view the movement. Not all movements are best viewed from the side, as we have seen in the previous examples. Some movements are really best viewed from the front or the back. These movements include trunk to upper arm angle. In other words, is the arm in the same plane as the trunk, or is it oblique or to the side? The elbow angle. How flexed or extended is the elbow during the movement? Lateral trunk bending. Is the body twisting or bending asymmetrically? On the other hand, other aspects of the movement are best viewed from the side, as we have been observing in the previous examples. These movements include the step. Is there a step? Which foot takes the step, and how large is the step? The trunk rotation. Does the trunk flex? Does the trunk rotate? Do the different components of the trunk rotate differentially? Lastly, the upper arm and forearm lag. Is the trunk leading the humerus during the forward rotation? Is the forearm lagging the humerus during the forward swing? Another important thing to keep in mind is that although we have used examples in which a cartoon or an individual is depicted at a single step for all components, rarely are the different components developed at the same rate. For example, a child in step 1 of foot action does not necessarily have to be in step 1 of trunk action or step 1 of the arm backswing. Also, not all individuals will achieve the highest step of performance. Depending on the experience, the coaching, and the interest in throwing, some individuals will achieve the highest levels, while many others will remain in lower levels of the component steps. Sex differences are more obvious in ballistic skills like throwing. There are a lot of longitudinal research studies to suggest that females perform more poorly on throwing and ballistic skills compared to males. This is a consistent difference that has been observed from the 1970s until today. When we examine the older end of the aging continuum, we see that older adults have achieved moderately advanced steps in overarm throwing components. As we mentioned, however, not all will achieve the top step or level of overarm throwing. However, we do not see a regression to lower steps. For example, if a young adult has step 3 of trunk action in aging, we don't expect to see that person regress to step 2 of trunk action. For the most part, even if you do not throw for a long period of time, the basic patterns of coordination that you achieved when you were younger are maintained. With that said, the throwing outcomes are slower and more variable in older adults compared with younger adults. What I mean by this is that the movement pattern is slower and that the final ball velocity is slower than young adults. Also, the patterns are less consistent and the range of movement and the final ball velocities differ from one throw to the next. Lastly, sex differences are still prevalent in older adults. This might simply reflect the sex differences seen in earlier development. In addition to individual constraints like muscle strength, balance, coordination, and the timing of different body segments, task constraints can influence the pattern of movements and steps for a particular set of components. For example, when the goal is to throw for accuracy versus speed or force, there appears to be a regression in the developmental step for each component. For example, to throw a ball accurately, you might not need to take a large step, or you might not rotate your body in the same way. In other words, you might try to throw the ball more like a dart, which has a very different set of movement patterns than if you were throwing for force. When the goal is to throw for distance versus speed or force, there is less of a regression or difference between the movement patterns from one type of throw to the other. This might be due to the fact that in order to throw a ball far, you need to generate a lot more force, and as such, the biomechanical properties might restrict the types of movements possible. This means that you might find more consistency in these types of movement patterns. One big take-home message is that if you want a child to show you the most advanced movement patterns that he or she has, you must get the child to throw for force. Okay. Before moving on to kicking, let's sum up what we have learned so far about the development of throwing, and mostly the development of overarm throwing. First, although we use product scores like ball velocity, distance, and accuracy, the process by which individuals throw is critical to understanding developmental differences in movement patterns. We have compared and contrasted the developmental sequence for throwing for early and proficient throwers, with respect to Table 8.1, and with respect to the observational plan for throwing in Figure 8.7. We have discussed the developmental changes in throwing and highlighted inter-individual differences in the steps achieved during childhood and adolescence. We have also examined changes in movement patterns in older adults and the individual factors that might influence those changes. Lastly, we have discussed how different task constraints, for example, the goal of the task, results in different movement patterns.